Hello, and welcome to this third training session in a sequence of sessions offered by the Stevens Initiative about virtual exchange. I'm Henry Shepard, Assistant Director of the Stevens Initiative, and we're so pleased that you're joining us today. Welcome back if you joined our previous two sessions, and welcome to Virtual Exchange if this is your first time in one of these meetings. We will be talking today about technology and logistics in virtual exchange, as well as overcoming common challenges, and being sure to take a moment to talk about other ways to get involved in the field. We'll also be answering plenty of your questions. So if at any point during this presentation you have any questions you'd like us to address, please type them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to them at the breaks in the presentations. If you have any other questions or any issues, technical issues or any other questions, you're welcome to use the chat box. I want to start by giving some background on the Stevens Initiative and virtual exchange. The Stevens Initiative aims to make international learning experiences available and accessible for an unprecedented number of young people through virtual exchange programs that connect young people in the United States and the Middle East and North Africa. The initiative is a lasting tribute to Ambassador Chris Stevens, who dedicated his career to building bridges between people in the United States and people in the Middle East and North Africa, or MENA region. Ambassador Stevens' time studying abroad and as a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco were formative experiences in his youth. The initiative was conceived and developed in 2015 in close partnership with the family of Ambassador Stevens, and the initiative is sponsored by the U.S. Department of State, with funding provided by the U.S. government and administered by the Aspen Institute. Additional funding is provided by the Bezos Family Foundation and the governments of Morocco and the United Arab Emirates. We believe that every young person has to have skills and knowledge to prosper in an interconnected but increasingly disrupted world. We know that even in the best of times, only a small minority of young people have access to in-person experiences like studying abroad. And during a period of travel restrictions, social distancing, and economic hardship, nearly all young people have had their in-person education and exchange plans disrupted. So we think technology can be used to conduct virtual exchange and help young people remain connected and continue their international learning at all times, and especially at times like this during a crisis. So this is a sentence or several sentences that we think lay out some of the key concepts of virtual exchange. In our understanding, virtual exchange uses technology to connect people for education and exchange. Virtual exchange programs typically serve young people. Many virtual exchange programs are international, connecting participants in different countries to help them gain global competencies, among other skills, and knowledge and abilities. The Stevens Initiative works in three main ways. We make grants to support promising and innovative virtual exchange programs. We try to serve as a knowledge hub to both develop and share knowledge in the field and circulate it among all of those who are practicing and bring it to those that are new to the field. And we try to galvanize the community of virtual exchange providers and participants by serving as an advocate and trying to raise awareness about virtual exchange in the broader public. Over the last several weeks, we've tried to launch a response to the pandemic, primarily in a few main areas. One area is these training sessions or orientations to virtual exchange. We're following that up with mentoring or coaching sessions that I'll say more about at the end of today's meeting. We've published a long list of resources that might be helpful to you as you think about designing or refining a program at this time. You can find information about that on the website link below. We've also launched a fund to support US, Middle East, and North Africa virtual exchange programs in one of the following ways that I list here on the screen. So there are a few different tracks in that competition. It's a rolling competition, again, open to US and Middle East and North Africa programs. And you can learn a lot more about that, as well as all of these other offerings on our website with the link below. With that being said, I'm so pleased to introduce today's presenters and discussants. Ramzi Naja, Head of Innovation for Nuvu and Karam Foundation, will be speaking about technology and logistics. Taylor Woodman, Internationalization Specialist in the University of Maryland Office of International Affairs, will be doing kind of a recap about overcoming common challenges in virtual exchange design and practice. Ed Graggart is joining us again to questions and engage in the question and answer session. He's the former executive director of Iron USA. And John Rubin is joining us again, creator and former director of the SUNY COIL Center and leader of the COIL style of programming, is again here to join us for a discussion as well. Again, I'm Henry Shepard, and I'll be really pleased to introduce my colleague Andy Schaefer to engage in some moderated discussion with presenters closer to the end of today's session. So with all of that being said, I'm excited to turn it over to Ramzi to talk about technology and logistics. Ramzi, take it away.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you everyone for being here today. So I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of dealing more with students that are in the teens and how to engage with virtual exchange, for specifically dealing with technology and logistics for that group. So if you can do the next slide, please. So how I'm going to start is by saying technology doesn't determine the type of—
Ramzi, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but do you think maybe you can adjust your microphone a little bit, because we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you? I'm so sorry.
No worries, I'm sorry about that. Does this sound better?
A little bit. I think maybe just closer and increasing the gain somehow would be great. And I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No worries, it's probably my internet, so I apologize. Is this sounding better?
A little bit. If folks can continue to use the chat box to let us know if this is working better, that would be great. Still pretty hard.
Okay, if you give me just 1 second, I'll reconnect my internet. I'm so sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you all for bearing with us, and I know we'll get started in just a moment. But I think this does illustrate some of the challenges around technology and logistics, even for those very practiced. So we will just get started in a second. Yeah, as folks are chiming in and saying this is a common challenge, and connections and technology are certainly fluctuating at this time when we're all using internet in ways that we don't usually, and from places we don't normally connect. So definitely a common experience. But as we've invited Ramzi here to talk about tech and logistics, we know he's very practiced at overcoming hurdles like this. So it's a great
let's hope so. Does this sound okay to people now?
It sounds better to me. Yep, it seems like early votes are yes.
Okay, great. So of course it's very fitting that I'm speaking about technology and logistics, and this is where the problem happens. So welcome to the world of virtual exchange. So to get back to it, so I'm starting off by saying technology does not determine the type of virtual exchange, rather it works the other way around. So when we think about technology and innovation, it's easy to imagine that a specific technology makes virtual exchange possible, and therefore the experience of exchange is tied to that. Whereas in reality, it is the approach or the intended outcome of a virtual exchange that determines the combinations. Oh, I'm reading that the sound is sounding off again.
Yeah, it's still pretty murky, unfortunately. If you can get closer to the mic, or maybe just go into your settings and increase your microphone gain, anything like that would be great. I'm really sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Let me try again. So sorry. Okay, does this sound better?
For the moment, yes.
Okay, so again, I'm sorry about this. This was working literally 10 minutes ago. So I'm really sorry, but I'm going to try to talk a bit slower, and please feel free to interrupt me if my sound is muffling.
I think just talking slowly and talking loud would be great, and we'll just hope for the best.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay, so I'll repeat one last time this introductory statement, but basically we're trying to look at not technology as what determines how a virtual exchange goes, but rather the experience or the intended outcome of a virtual exchange as what determines the technology we want to use. So in certain cases, we're going to be looking at using multiple technologies in order to serve the purpose of said virtual exchange. Next slide, please. So looking at available technology, I see them as being in 3 different categories. One of them is video conferencing. Later on, we'll go through options for that, but we oftentimes think this is the most important, and I'm going to try to convince you otherwise today. Second is email and chat or textual exchange, what I try to call semi-synchronous exchange. And finally, content sharing, which is basically the sharing of information and files.
Ramzi, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but do you think maybe we could try to have you dial in? I know this is going to be tricky because there might not be a local dial-in number where you are, but do you think you might be able to dial in by phone and we could try to go to Taylor for the moment and come back to you after his presentation?
Sure, let me try that. Let me try dialing my phone. So sorry about this again.
No problem. Nope, it's okay. This is real-time practice, and nothing goes easily.
Thank you.
So Ramzi, if it's okay, we'll go to Taylor and we'll come back to you soon.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to try to click ahead. I think this is okay substantively because talking about technology and logistics and talking about overcoming common challenges, it's really two sides of the same coin in some settings, as we're finding out here today as well. So we'll be sure to come back to Ramzi's slides, which I know will be very helpful. So I'm just going to quickly click through them. And Taylor, can I ask you to take the mic and do a quick mic check?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you. So we're going to click ahead to your section. Thanks for being willing to dive in. And I know we'll come back to some more details about how we address making interesting choices about technology and dealing with logistics and thinking about asynchronous communication and synchronous communication. So let's switch gears a little bit now and think a little bit more about the sort of the big picture. We're kind of focusing now on in practice, whether we're at the design stage, whether we're at the implementation stage. We've asked Taylor here to talk about what we need to keep in mind because even the best laid plans often don't happen in practice the way we imagine. And so what are some things from your experience administering programs, supporting those who run programs? What's your experience with how we can make the best of some challenges that might come up? So I'm going to advance into your slides.
Thank you so much, Henry. I'm happy to pick up here and talk through some of those more common logistical challenges and hopefully provide some tips that will reduce the learning curve for the development of your international virtual exchanges. As Henry said in the beginning, I currently serve as internationalization specialist at the University of Maryland, where the bulk of my responsibility is to provide direct faculty support on the design and delivery of international virtual exchanges, or what we at Maryland call global classroom courses. Additionally, I teach in the College of Education, where I have led study abroad courses and utilized international virtual exchanges to strengthen my existing study abroad partnerships, as well as offer students an additional opportunity to have a global experience. I say this to let you know that I work across disciplines, regions, and modalities with faculty at various comfort levels, and I myself have run into many of the same ups and downs of designing and delivering an international virtual exchange as you may find yourself in now. This also gives you a sense of my framing as I approach virtual exchange from a higher education for-credit lens. I do think my experience lends itself to other contexts, but I want to make sure you understand my grounding and why I use some of the terms like faculty or student. Throughout the presentation, I will try to use more inclusive words like learner for students or participants, and facilitator, instructor in place of faculty. I seek your insight to share with me your challenges and needs across levels and program type to see if I can offer tips that address your unique needs. Additionally, Ramzi and our discussants can provide tips from their unique perspectives as well. On a final note, a recording of this session will be made available after our time together, and my contact information follows in the following slide, and the last slide. Many of us are finding ourselves needing to rapidly transition previously designed in-person global experiences or practices into virtual exchanges. I've attempted to categorize the main challenges I and other instructors encounter in designing and delivering these types of learning opportunities with an eye to elevate common challenges and tips to reduce the learning curve. To help us remember them, I call them the 4 T's of international virtual exchange: technology, task, teams, and time, as you see on the slides here. I'll go into detail about each one of these in the slides ahead. Next slide, please. So let's start with technology. On our webinar in a little bit later, Ramzi will provide some great insight into the various types of technological tools that can be utilized, but I'll just share some additional practical tips here too. First, it's important to survey the different types of technological tools you can use. If you're an institution, are there certain platforms your instructors typically use that this activity can integrate into? For instance, at Maryland, our instructors use Canvas as our learning management system, or LMS. We encourage our faculty to centralize all their virtual exchange components into this LMS, so there's a central space for the course materials and student engagement, and to make sure we can offer additional IT support. However, when examining your own LMS, you should also ask your counterparts what systems they are comfortable using in an effort to find common ground. Additionally, ask what tools their students are using. Students often use messaging services or social media platforms for peer-to-peer engagement that complements their LMS engagement. This can give you insight into facilitating student-to-student engagement. Next, testing. Testing is a must. We've tested multiple times the technology for this, and we ran into issues today, but it's always important to test and set up time in advance to log on and utilize all of your technology before engaging, so you reduce some of that transition time or some of the challenges that might come up when technology fails. I suggest at the beginning of any synchronous session, design an activity to test in real time what your learners are asked to do, so you can highlight any potential kinks. This is especially helpful when trying out a new application or tool within your platform. Additionally, expect to fail. Even with the best laid plans, as we see today, tech failures always occur. Build in that additional setup time, think through your backup plans, and start contingency planning before you begin. And also think about what can be made asynchronously in advance and what can be made asynchronously on the fly. And then also think about other ways that you can reduce bandwidth issues by using audio instead of video. Lastly, help your learners see technological environment that they are entering as a space for education. Be vulnerable when there are failures. Ask your students to problem solve with you. Create prompts that integrate the infrastructure or our reliance on technology, or the future of remote work, or even Wi-Fi as a right. Next slide, please. Task. When I talk about task, I'm referring to our approach and the activities that help you reach the learning goals for your program. Research on what tasks lead to successful international virtual exchange engagement is still under-researched in the scholarly literature. So I cannot offer a clear checklist for adoption, but instead I'll offer some tips that have been successful for our UMD instructors. Many virtual exchanges utilize project-based learning, which values real-world applicability that addresses global and local issues, and makes contributions beyond the confines of the learning environment or experience. Depending on your discipline or training, this type of approach may be a challenge to wrap your head around. Continue to educate yourself on project-based learning practices and project examples. A good place to start is to engage outside networks for project ideas or peruse the resource section or knowledge hub that Stevens has provided. Curricular alignment shows my grounding in the academy, but others might work for an organization and strive for mission alignment. What I'll suggest in this challenging time is, put simply, you should select partnerships, projects, and activities that help your learners achieve the stated learning goals. Now is not the time for scope creep, rather a need to prioritize the core or essence of your previously constructed exchange and what I think is essential for your success in avoiding burnout. The most successful international virtual exchanges I see are formative in nature. Traditional Western-style learning environments that provide knowledge and require a final project at the end are not as successful in this type of learning environment. Instead, start to break down the final project or deliverable for your students into manageable step-by-step tasks that lead to the construction of a final project. When having students engage for the first time, create icebreakers. For instance, I have my students upload a 60-second video where they discuss who they are and their interest and why they enrolled in my course. All students watch these videos before our first synchronous meeting, and this puts a face with a name on a roster and helps students find commonalities. Other examples you might want to use are have students upload their favorite recipe, or in this particular time, have students give a tour of their home, or discuss their family structure or other cultural elements. Lastly, I suggest creating a low-stakes activity in the beginning that helps students acquaint themselves with the tech, the other learners in the virtual classroom, and your expectations for the class or activity. Trust me, this will reduce emails in your inbox and work out any kinks or failures, as I just discussed in the previous tech slides. It is important to note that learners are working in a new modality across cultures. These exchanges can be awkward in the beginning, and learners may not know where to start. So providing clear guidance on the task ahead will help students start finding effective ways to work together. I'll share more on the team aspect of these exchanges in the next slide, but before I do, I just ask you to take yourself back to when you first started a new job, or even thinking about creating a virtual exchange if you're new to this environment. It can be challenging to engage in something new. Build a framework to start navigating this new activity. For instance, ask yourself what would have helped you become more successful in the beginning of creating a virtual exchange, and build those supports for your learners. An example of a resource I developed for my students was a simple meeting template that provided students with a framework for navigating their first meeting. As time goes on, students become more comfortable in this environment and were allowed more flexibility in the task completion activities and can structure their meetings as they saw fit. Lastly, think about the next iteration of this project as well, and incorporate a question into your evaluation measures that addresses task guidance to have students generate new resource ideas for you. Next slide, please. Teams. When I talk about teams, I'm really talking about the community needed to build these types of exchanges. For our designers in the room, consider reciprocity and sustainability in these exchanges. Ask yourself who has power in these partnerships or relationships, and how can you work towards shared ownership? Make sure in the beginning you have conversations that clearly discuss expectations, divisions of labor, ownership of materials, and even what the future of this exchange is. Many of us are entering these exchanges to transition physical mobility exercises and may think this is a simple band-aid, but these exchanges should live beyond this particular context, in my opinion. A great place to start when working to find or strengthen partnerships is to start working with the partnerships you already have for these face-to-face exchanges. You've likely already had some of these conversations and built rapport previously. At University of Maryland, we provide grants for our faculty, which often lead to power imbalances because of the additional financial support that the UMD instructor receives. So we ask our faculty to acknowledge this in conversations with their partner, and often invite our international partners into mentoring sessions and workshops that provide access to UMD resources and offer documentation or MOUs of their exchange to show that we honor our partners as equals. Additionally, for our designers, think about knowledge equity. Knowledge equity really refers to acknowledging the expertise of both partners and the unique perspectives they bring to this exchange. For instance, at UMD, we have a course that partners with a university in Ghana to offer an African perspective to the practice of student affairs in an attempt to decolonize the current student affairs practice. Additionally, partners need to acknowledge the language of instruction and the differing comfort levels learners and instructors have with this language. Language is a form of power, but can also be used as an equalizer. For example, I viewed exchanges that operate in the second language of both learners. For my instructors and facilitators out there, these topics and questions above are helpful, but you'll also be in direct contact with our learners. So with our learners in mind, consider these tips. Work to find like learners. What I mean by this is pairing first-year freshmen with first-year freshmen, for instance. Pairing a first-year freshman class with a graduate classroom abroad will lead to frustrations on both sides. Additionally, acknowledge the cross-cultural environment. A successful international virtual exchange will allow students to reflect on their own assumptions and cultural norms and reach to build a more relative understanding of their culture. It's important as the instructor to build in STEAM exhaust valves or reflection activities throughout the exchange to allow you as the instructor to engage the learner about culture and reframe differing cultural approaches to the task content in a more formative manner. Without these check-ins, students can very easily adopt an ethnocentric viewpoint that values their approach to the learning experience without ever considering the strengths in their peers' approach. Lastly, do not underestimate the need to build community among your learners. Find activities or prompts to have learners find commonalities. The example in the previous slides about building the interactions with short introductions or sharing of recipes or like activities may be helpful to incorporate to build community. Remember, virtual exchanges are collaborations, which take substantial work to become successful, but this work is not done in vain, as our learners are living in a globalized and diverse world that values and expects citizens to understand various perspectives and work effectively in diverse teams. Next slide. Lastly, the issue of time. In the most basic sense, consider time differences. Don't forget about changes due to daylight savings time. Consider your partner's academic calendars and academic timelines, and even start to think through local holidays in an effort to set yourself up for success. Make sure to share these with your students or learners too, to have them explore and develop a project timeline. I also suggest putting together a weekly summary for students to show how you think they should approach the class activities, or even incorporating an activity where students put together their own time management plans for the course ahead, and having them submit this at the beginning of class so you can provide feedback and discuss your expectations of their time engagement. For example, for me, in terms of time, my partners in Cuba go on holiday from the end of July through August, so setting up a late summer virtual exchange will not lead to successful cross-cultural engagement. Additionally, in this current context, many of us are being forced into this new modality with varying comforts in the technological space or supports. Be empathetic, give each other grace, and realize that you are doing something challenging, and this is the first iteration of hopefully an ongoing virtual partnership. I suggest creating an evaluation that will provide constructive feedback for areas of the virtual exchange that you can adjust or tweak in the future. Additionally, do an audit of your current physical activity. What content is not essential or does not require face-to-face, or in this case, synchronous meetings that can be moved to the asynchronous space, like a recorded lecture or moving discussions into a discussion board format. This also takes into consideration bandwidth or access issues and allows learners to move through certain content at their own pace. Also think creatively about the virtual exchange. Are there activities you can create for students that do not require your time? For instance, many language programs use what's called e-tandem method to virtual exchange that creates learner-to-learner environments where language practice occurs. The instructor simply sets up the network, creates prompts or tasks, but leaves it up to the students to find a common time to engage. Lastly, it is important to note that your time is a limited resource. International virtual exchanges take time to build. Reflection and formative assessments require additional feedback and grading time, and the virtual and cross-cultural environment brings up new challenges for you as the instructor. Develop key questions to determine the time you can give to this endeavor. For instance, do you have administrative, technological, or instructional assistance? What are the turnaround times for those support services? Or consider the learner perspective. What may impact your learners' ability to turn in their assignments on time? Or ask yourself if there are unique cultural conceptions of time to be considered. Next slide. In closing, I want to say that many of us are scrambling to find a way to transition face-to-face global experiences to virtual opportunities at an unprecedented speed. I commend you for your efforts and your commitment for seeking new avenues for our learners to have a global opportunity, but I ask for you to look beyond this current challenge and see those opportunities not only as a needed stopgap measure or band-aid to the current situation this pandemic has created, but as a distinct international activity for your students to pursue now and beyond this pandemic that furthers global learning competencies and continues to build upon the partnerships you have worked tirelessly to create with your counterparts. While the road ahead is not easy, I'm hopeful that this conversation, along with other presentations, upcoming breakout sessions and mentoring programs, as well as the resources that Stevens is offering, will continue to help ease your burden. I'll leave you with a few highlighted resources on the slide here that will expose you to the community, current scholarship, and a whole host of best practices of international virtual exchange. Each image here is hyperlinked for you to explore on your own time. I encourage you to review these resources, and I wish you well. Next slide. Thank you for your time and listening to my presentation. My contact information is here should you need me. Additionally, I'll be offering one-to-one mentoring sessions next month, and I'll turn it back over to Andy and Henry now to transition to the next portion of our webinar. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Taylor. And you mentioned that the slide was hyperlinked. I'm not sure folks watching this as a screen share are able to click on it themselves, but you can probably Google search or just web browser search any of the key terms that Taylor had mentioned, and I'll click back just so you can see them one more time. Certainly starting with the Stevens Initiative website, where we list lots of resources on the resources page, including this one here. The IVEC conference and community is listed here, the Virtual Exchange Coalition, the Journal of Virtual Exchange, and the Global Classrooms Initiative should all be something you can find, and we'll do what we can to make sure that you can trace back to these things in the recording that we share. We do share a recording of these sessions on YouTube, so we'll be posting that in the next several days when that becomes available. So I want to do a quick check now, and just first of all, before I do that, to thank Taylor again for the great presentation. We'll be coming back to some big picture questions that speak to the kinds of issues and cross-cutting challenges that Taylor was describing in a few minutes. But now I want to do a quick mic check with Ramzi again. Ramzi, are you there? And do you think we can turn to your section?
Yes, I'm here. I think I need to ask people how I sound, and if I sound okay, I'm ready to go.
You sound really good to me. What a relief. So why don't I
Okay.
click back? Forgive me for awkwardly clicking back through all the slides, but I don't know a better way to do this quickly. So just going to bear with it. Okay, why don't you start here, since I think we couldn't hear you very well, and don't worry about going too fast. We'll take whatever time we need to go through your section. So Ramzi, please take it away and talk, now that you're fully here and audible, about technology and logistics.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Henry. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. So hopefully the internet will be nicer to us this time, and by the end of this presentation, we'll be prepared for such instances in the future. So I'd like to begin by kind of subverting the idea that technology actually paves the way for virtual exchange. Of course it does, but we want to look at this in a way where we think of virtual exchange, or the intended outcome of a virtual exchange experience, as the defining factor behind the technologies we use. So we can go to the next slide. We're talking about 3 types of available technologies. The first is video conferencing. More later about different platforms that provide these technologies. The second is email and chat, and the third is content sharing. So on the next slide, we'll talk about how virtual exchange is relying on a mixture of synchronous and asynchronous communication. So how that relates to these technologies is that video, the first tech, is actually a completely synchronous exchange. So we're live in the same virtual space with the person we're having this virtual exchange experience with. While this is very important, it also is kind of the more mundane aspect of the virtual exchange. Where it becomes more interesting is email and chat, which I like to call semi-synchronous. So here we potentially get a notification over a texting service, or we receive an email and we're free to respond to it at will, or even to read it at a different time. The third and final one is content, and this is totally asynchronous for the most part. So if we're working on a project, we're somehow sharing our progress on that project. How that content is shared will have a huge impact on the synchronous exchange. For instance, if I'm able to see my colleagues' notes before we enter a video conference call, then we will probably have a much more successful experience during that synchronous exchange. So again, a combination of all of these technologies is what makes this duality of synchronous and asynchronous exchange possible, and that is inspired by or fueled by the type of virtual exchange we hope to have. Next slide, please. So thinking about asynchronous exchange, what are some questions that help us kind of identify what the asynchronous aspect will look like, and how this will help us select tools we need and the way in which we want to use them? So how are ideas being shared? What type of tools are we using to share these ideas? Do we need sketches? Is it more of bubble diagrams? Are things more textual? All of that impacts the types of tools we're using. Is sharing progress for a certain project important? So do we want to see every step our colleague is working on so that we could work together? Or is it enough to share at just one point in time? Is there space for feedback? So even if we are sharing these steps, would we like to receive feedback from our colleague? Is it important for us to be able to give them feedback on the work they're doing to enhance our virtual exchange experience? Are media visual or textual? So in certain cases, it might just be having, a lot of prose describing the project, or it might be more like bullet points, but it might also be an actual drawing that illustrates progress that has been made. And then that's what's being shared to propel the project forward. How accessible is the content? So this is also important in determining whether our entire group of students who are in a virtual exchange have access to everyone else's work, or maybe a certain group or a pair of students have access to their own content, but only share it at the very end. So different platforms will allow different privacy settings and the possibility to adjust privacy settings at different points. Finally, is timing fundamental? So this covers actually a range of questions. Do we care if there are timestamps, or do we want to know when a certain update is made to a project? Or even as facilitators, do we want to know at what point students are actually posting a response, or at what frequency of time they're engaged? And of course, the answer may be that this is not important at all, but in instances where it is, technology will largely affect how we manage this. Next slide, please. So here we're going to talk a little bit about determining which technologies we're going to use in light of what we just discussed. So first, video conferencing. There's a ton of options out there. I think by now, given recent events, everyone knows probably half of what's out there. But there's always more, and there's always a surprising range of services that will actually allow for something very specific that might be needed for a certain virtual exchange. So I would recommend the online video conferencing guide. Fittingly, the URL is videoconferencing.guide, and they track somewhere between 30 and 40 services and their capabilities. So some examples that I found to be reliable. Whereby.com is unique in that you can have a direct link. So it would be whereby.com / the name of your virtual exchange, school, any of the above. The downside is it's only free for up to, actually it's only free for up to 4 users. I apologize for that, and paid for up to 12. Zoom, which probably everyone knows by now, is free for up to 40 minutes. I found the big downside there to be that there's a meeting number, sometimes a password for kids that actually might prove to be a barrier to entry. Jitsi is very similar to Zoom, open source, not as well designed. Cisco WebEx, similar. This is free for nonprofits, so that might prove advantageous. Although there are reports of people getting free access to full versions of many software for being nonprofits or academic institutions. A final note is that mobile-friendly services are actually very important, because a lot of students, no matter kind of their home situation or the school they go to, may have difficulty accessing the internet. They might not have access to a laptop, and oftentimes the mobile kind of takes away a lot of these barriers. Next slide, we'll talk about chat or email or this kind of semi-synchronous exchange. So one service that a lot of people in the professional world are familiar with is Slack. And it's unique in that it has no impact on privacy. So it is actually very easy to set up a virtual chat space where there's no link to phone number, social media profile, or any such thing. So this is where it is advantageous. And while some kids may actually choose to engage with each other on social media as a result of a virtual exchange, we still wouldn't want to kind of pose any pressure on them feeling like they have to give up their Instagram profile or even, what their name is on Facebook and whatnot. If we're using emails instead of something like that, which is also completely fine, there are some logistics that come into play. So supervisors or facilitators of the exchange would want to be copied to have some form of tracking of the conversations. It is, I believe, a little bit slower than direct chat, but also there's the ability to attach things. So here it might incorporate the content aspect also of communication. So the examples are the obvious in terms of the social media accounts, so WhatsApp, Instagram, Messenger, each with its own implications in terms of privacy, Slack being the easiest in that sense. And oftentimes kids have school email accounts if they're at schools, but creating accounts with Gmail is very easy and quick. And finally, on the next slide, we can talk about content sharing. So ease of access is really important here. So, attachments, their size matters a lot. How easily we can actually get to a link, or if a link loads, or if the URL is too long, it can't be copied, and all kinds of strange things that happen when we try to access files. So any kind of simple or familiar interface where things can go and we can just find them pretty much will work, and this will vary based on the need. So jumping right into the examples, Google Docs, Sheets, and Slides, super easy. Most people are familiar with them, or even, at least with Microsoft PowerPoint, there is some familiarity there. And it's easy actually to toggle sharing options. So for instance, facilitators may share a presentation at the beginning where students don't have the ability to edit, but they do have the ability to view. Or perhaps students are sharing their development of working on some form of graphical documentation in Google Sheets or Excel, and they keep the edit capability locked until they're ready for input from their colleague directly on the file. So that maneuverability is important. If we're directly sharing files, a Photoshop file, a CAD file for students going more in the direction of design, we transfer Dropbox, and there are a range of other options. Of course, here the advantage is when there's a shared folder and updated files are seen regularly. The disadvantage is a file can't really comfortably be live edited. So there's give and take. I'll also here mention the NewView platform, which is what we use at NewView and for the current program and at all our partner schools. It's, I think, one of very few, if not the only, learning platform that uses blog style sharing. So students are making regular posts, and it's very easy to determine how shareable or editable these posts are. So colleagues working together are able to edit each other's work. They're able to pick when it's shared with the rest of the studio. The progress is all documented, but only the final outcome is publicly shared, for instance. Next slide, please. So I'll end by giving just some general tips on logistics. In light of this conversation, I should definitely say, have a backup plan if your internet isn't working very well. And the internet will always surprise us, so never trust that it's going to go smoothly. But more seriously, having an agenda for student meetings is extremely important. It makes kids feel more comfortable. Kids, teens, young adults feel more comfortable walking into a conversation knowing more or less what they're going to talk about. And then within the conversation, determining when will we speak again, what do we expect to speak about, what will we be doing in the interim. Second, share ideas, sketches, and or progress before this conversation. So if I'm going into a conversation where we're going to analyze how we've developed a 3D printable part for a certain project, if we've both seen the file before and maybe even each other's notes, we as students will be more comfortable having this conversation. Finally, monitor asynchronous communication channels regularly. So for engagement to be in a healthy place, students will want to feel like their colleagues are seeing their work regularly. And I believe part of the duty facilitators carry is making sure there's smoothness there. The data being shared is always being received and seen on the other side, and that there's a healthy level of response to that. And of course, please motivate students to lead the conversations. Teenagers can definitely be awkward, but oftentimes they're much better at us at dealing with each other. So that's I think key for any conversation between students at that level. And last slide, please. Thank you. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to email me and find some resources related to this on the website. Thank you very much, and I apologize again for the internet difficulties.
No problem, Ramzi. And I have a couple quick questions for you, and then one for both you and the other discussants. And then we'll turn it over to Andy for like a great recap conversation. The first question is, can you say a little bit about what aspects of what you have done at NewView and Karam Foundation, what of that might be available to the public, if anything?
Yes, thank you for asking that, actually. So since we use the NewView platform, actually almost every project done, it should be every project done is publicly available. So I can, if you actually go to the websites, you'll be able to make your way there. But if you email me, I'll give you a direct link where you can look at specific projects that were done through virtual exchange. I'm also happy to offer temporary access where you can go in and see all the steps students have taken and how they've documented them without making this public.
Thanks so much. So your inbox is open as we posted here on the screen, and you're welcoming folks to get in touch with you if they'd like to ask more about that. It's a very generous offer. We had maybe the best question of any of these three sessions, the least theoretical, most practical question so far. How did you overcome that tech hurdle, Ramzi, where your microphone didn't seem to be going super well? So just walk us through your thought process as it was happening, and what did you do to overcome it?
Yes, great question. So first of all, I actually have two Wi-Fi connections, which is very lucky. So usually I just immediately switch to the second. When that didn't work, I switched to my phone connection, and I predicted the end that actually there's a problem from my laptop in relation to the internet. So sometimes the internet will glitch, but then your laptop doesn't fully recover from that glitch. And I had my phone charged to 100% next to making sure I have enough data in my package, and was just able to immediately connect there. So basically two backup plans in the least.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for explaining that. I think having 2 internet connections probably sounds like, whew, that's a lot to imagine having. Maybe not everybody has that available, but going from phone to thinking about whether it's your device or your connection or your login or any of those different things, just kind of toggling all of the possible options in your head is a great step. And I think we were also, I noticed that you saw people typing messages in the chat box. So you were also paying attention for feedback. You weren't just charging ahead, which was really great. And it meant that even though we had to interrupt you, it still was pretty seamless. I want to open a question to you and to the others here about tech privacy. There was a comment that you made, Ramzi, that has come up a bit in these sessions, and I know it's oftentimes at the forefront of people's minds when they think about going into a virtual environment. And that is, what's a good way to think about keeping young people safe, whether they are minors, children, or whether they are young adults who are adults, but still you have to be thinking about what's a good environment. And you talked about Slack as one example of a platform that's not necessarily connected to our other social media accounts. So if you and others could say more about the amount of monitoring or involvement or stepping in that adults do, that facilitators or staff do in those smaller group settings, what is the appropriate, what's the angle that you've taken, Ramzi, in that kind of phone-based or message-based communication? What's appropriate for the young people who are minors that you work with? And then I want to turn over to Taylor and maybe John as well to get the higher ed perspective.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So actually, this is not an easy issue at all. We've had endless conversations about how to best manage this, and I have to say I've learned a lot from my colleagues at Karam Foundation, because there's 2 layers. First of all, you don't want kids to be able necessarily to invade each other's privacy. Specifically in the programs we work in, kids are not in the same school, so they probably don't know each other at all, and maybe don't want to have any kind of Facebook relationship or Instagram or whatnot. So we do actually avoid in every way possible putting them in a situation where they share personal profiles, account names, or numbers, and we actually even give them program specific emails that they can use if they want to use email, and our platform typically fills most of the space. But also another factor is you want kids to engage directly with each other, but you also want adults. So we try to have an adult in the conversation, but also to kind of have the smallest possible number of adults there. And we try to avoid or even using the term monitoring, but we do have to keep an eye out to just make sure everyone is feeling comfortable, building trust with kids, so that if they feel uncomfortable in a certain encounter, they're ready to come to us or to come to their mentors directly and say, this has made me feel uncomfortable. And this has happened multiple times, and it has been resolved very, very smoothly. So I think even trusting the kids and making feel like they can trust us to share their discomfort goes a long way.
And I would just add to what Ramzi said there, in the higher ed perspective, is that we have a number of discriminatory and harassment policies, and that lives within our LMS or that Canvas site for all students to see and engage with. And so when we put both our international counterparts as well as our students there, they read and sign that they're going to abide by that. We as instructors get information about recording and asking for permission, those types of things. But I will say the benefit in the higher education space is a lot of our IT experts are making sure that these systems adhere to the privacy standards that we have. And that's really why we encourage our faculty to centralize all of their engagement within these virtual exchanges in the LMS that we utilize. I don't know, John, if you have other insight.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of issues here. I'll tackle the last one first, which is if you're working with in your own learning management system, your own IT people may be there for you, but you're working with a partner in another country and they may be less comfortable in your LMS. So I don't think that's a simple solution. It's a solution, but what if your partner wants you to work in their LMS or in a third party platform such as Padlet or some other tool which you don't know so well? So these issues of control and privacy, I think, are lurking all about us in this field. I don't have a quick solution. I think it is important to research how each of them works. Furthermore, and I hate even almost to bring this up, that there are two privacy mechanisms. One is in the US, it's called FERPA, and one is based in Europe, and it's called GDPR. And these are two sets of rules and guidelines that tell us, to some degree, what we are and are not allowed to share and in what way. They are rather difficult to understand, especially GDPR, which hasn't even been fully adjudicated. But it does mean that, for instance, if you use a platform and a student logs in and then says, I don't like this, they have to be able to instantly remove themselves from being visible on that platform. GDPR requires the ability to withdraw data, and some platforms are not so good at that. Once you're there, you're sort of there. And this is definitely a murky area. I don't want to belabor it because I think it also scares people for fear that they'll somehow break a rule that they don't fully understand. And I almost wish in some ways GDPR didn't exist because it affects people so strongly, but the guidelines are not so clear. But this is a different kind of privacy. This is not so much about one student harassing another. This is about whether the systems you're using to engage all your students are acceptably privacy conscious themselves as tools. So I'm going to stop there because I can't really bring this to a clarity point, but in a way you have to look at your procedures, not just the tools, because to some extent it's how you bring your students into the platforms where the privacy issues may arise. I'm going to leave it there for the moment.
Thank you all so much. That's you did a great job illuminating some different aspects of the issue. So I want to turn it over now that I've clicked ahead a bit to my colleague, Andy Schaefer. These are questions that are intended to sort of recap a lot of what we've covered throughout the sessions, this session and the previous two sessions. So if you weren't there for the previous two sessions, you'll get a taste of the kinds of questions we talked about earlier. And if you've been to all three of them, this hopefully will be a chance to reflect on them. So Andy, I invite you to take the microphone and help us explore some big questions.
Yeah, thank you, Henry, and thank you to all of our panelists. That was a really enriching discussion, and we wanted to kind of start the discussion portion of today's meeting by asking our panelists about some common challenges in both designing and implementing virtual exchange programs. And what you're going to see in the next couple of slides is in no way meant to be an exhaustive list. There are many challenges in designing and implementing virtual exchange, many of which are entirely unique to a particular program. And we want to make sure that we get to the audience's questions and challenges as well. So I just wanted to talk through a few challenges with our panelists. For the audience listening, the Stevens Initiative has published an impact and learning report late last year that contains a rather robust, but again, not exhaustive summary of common challenges and effective practices in implementing virtual exchange. So I want to ask this first question of you, Taylor, since you talked earlier through troubleshooting so many aspects of a virtual exchange program, and I also invite our other panelists if they have thoughts to add to this question. But what are some hallmarks or attributes of effective and engaging virtual exchange activities? If someone is starting out designing a virtual exchange, maybe they don't know where to start when it comes to activity design for the actual exchange component. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Andy, for that. And I'll keep my answer here short just to make sure I don't monopolize the time. But what I think is needed and is most central when developing and implementing a virtual exchange is that reflection piece. So figuring out how you can hear directly from your learners throughout this process. Again, they're engaging across cultures in a new modality, or there might be different technological issues, time conceptions. And so without having those check-ins or those reflective activities where you can hear directly from your students, what I've seen is at the end of the semester is really then where students let you know that this wasn't effective, or they had issues with the teamwork or the assignment that they had to create. So I really think any way that you can embed throughout the process ways that you can either hear from your students or meet with them one-on-one, or hear from them about their group work or this particular activity is really, really essential. And sometimes something we don't think about because we're focused on the delivering of the content or the actual deliverable of the exchange itself.
Do any of our other panelists have thoughts?
Hi, this is Ed from IERN. And what we've seen over the years is that one of the most important hallmarks or attributes we saw was, to what extent did the virtual exchange, interaction, project work, whatever, lead to new questions, new areas of inquiry? Did it result in student motivation to learn further? And also when students actually exhibit both the learning, but also empathy, and also some of the skills that the facilitators may in fact be exhibiting as well, so that they're learning those skills that they're seeing being exhibited in their actual virtual exchange. And when they exhibit those, to me, that's one of the most important attributes of an effective virtual exchange.
Thank you. Maybe we can move to another question that we've seen come up in the Q&A box in a few of these trainings over the last week. Some of our panelists today represent virtual exchange that is very flexible with technology, and some of our panelists represent virtual exchange that uses one specific platform for collaboration and engagement. So I want to first pose this question to you, John, because COIL doesn't necessarily have a specific prescription for technology or a specific platform. So can you talk a little bit about how you choose a technology platform, since there are so many options out there, and one may not meet a specific need?
Yeah, thanks for asking me such a difficult question. And there isn't a simple answer, and it would take a while to parse the whole cascade of questions one should probably ask. But I'll provide two responses. One is, if you are the initiating organization, institution, professor, i.e. you're the one who dreamed up this idea that you want to do a COIL course, and you're reaching out to somebody abroad who may be less familiar to this with you, you're already in a power dynamic with that school or teacher, and ultimately potentially with those students. So you're actually raising a kind of equity issue even before you've begun. And one way to counteract that, and this comes to your question, is to turn to your potential partner before you start designing the course and say, let's work in your learning management system, or let's work in some platform that you are familiar with, because you're then giving them some control over the actual tools that you'll be using. And I'd even go to the extent of maybe their learning management system has a menu that's in another language. I wouldn't hide from that. I would possibly say that's a good idea, because your students, let's say they're English speaking and your partners are not, if that's the case, it's not hard to learn a dozen words in another language. And that's usually all you need to manage the pull downs. Usually you can type in any language. So I'm just giving that as an example. That the choice of platform is not just about what technology is best, but it has to do with power. And so this is a part of all virtual exchange. And secondly, I would say the tendency I would have is to be not in learning management systems. This is really a tough one and really complex, but all learning management systems tend to be designed for coursework per se. And one of the things you're trying to do in a virtual exchange is to some degree steer a little away from seeing this as accomplishing knowledge learning tasks and providing solutions. You really want engagement. You want your students to engage each other and to talk about things that mean something to them. And I don't think most learning management systems are ideally constructed for that. They're designed for something else. Doesn't mean they can't be utilized well, but something like, say, Padlet, which I'm not going to discuss in detail, might be more wide open, might not lead people so directly to saying, okay, how do we solve this problem so we get a good grade and we're on to the next thing. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, John. I wonder, Ed or Ramzi, if you have thoughts about this question from the perspective of the programs that you all have worked on that do use a specific or customized platform, either for coursework or for the actual like collaboration and exchange.
I can comment briefly on that, and that, you know, in line with what I said in my talk, I do believe in a combination of different technologies, but we do encounter situations where a certain school has their LMS and they insist on having everything there. And I do think it's important to be accommodating of that, but also equally to ask for accommodation to make things smoother for people on the other side of the virtual exchange. So we do end up in situations where sometimes data is double posted, or there are two places for information to be. And here we put a big effort into minimizing the overlap of information. So perhaps videos and images go one place, but emails or person-to-person contact happens in a different place, for instance.
This is Ed. I really like the end of this question because when none of them seem perfect, and I think that's probably what, I mean, certainly that's what we found, and that's what most people are going to find, that no one platform or technology meets everyone's needs. And when we, dealing with the K-12 community and dealing with kids who are quite young, minors, and also dealing with a network that's quite large, we decided that because no off-the-shelf platform was sufficient, we decided to build one with assistance. And what we learned is that one, it could provide features that met needs, but also it kept people in the same community. And so the people had a much shorter learning curve for professional development among teachers and students around the world. When you're teaching how to manage and how to interact, how to share data, media, whatever, in a common platform, it was much easier to expand around the world. And also it was much easier to protect young people's IDs. We don't collect email addresses from students, for example, and we don't share teachers' email addresses, but within the community, within that safe and secure platform, there's a chance for students to really be very expressive and to engage, but in a common platform that everybody can quickly understand and learn how to do.
Thank you so much for that. The last question that hopefully we can cover very briefly, since I know we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, is about participant engagement. And maybe we can start with you, Ed, because IERN's reach is so massive, and I'm sure that this is something that you might be familiar with. What should an implementer do if the staff or facilitators observe that participants on one side of an exchange might be less engaged or comfortable than the participants on another side of the exchange? I think we've heard a lot in our experience that sometimes participants from one region or country might be more excited and engaged, and then another side might not be as enthused. And when that happens, a whole exchange can suffer, since you need at least two parties for an exchange. So I'm curious for your thoughts.
Sure, thanks for the question. I mean, it's a great one because when we started in the late 80s, we did pair one school with one school. And indeed, because of all the issues that we've dealt with today, time schedules around the world, whatnot, or technology failures, when the virtual exchange had a disruption, that meant two classes were broken apart. And so we turned to group interaction. And so any one project may have 5, 10, 20 different schools, classes participating or non-classes. And so there's a much larger chance, or better chance, that the dialogue, the interaction will continue. And then always you notice that there may be one country, one class, one individual who is not participating as much as others. And I think it's really important then to look at and ask questions of maybe a teacher or a group leader in that country. You know, is it a language issue? Is it a gender issue? Is it simply a different learning style issue? Or is it a conversation all about dominant cultural values that I don't share? And so you need to do a little bit of a needs assessment as to why that lack of engagement is happening. And it's also very important to establish a norm at the very beginning that in collaboration, there's an acceptance of all views and experiences, and they're all equally valuable. We used to have a coordinator in Argentina who was very fond of saying that no one person knows so much that he or she can't learn from another, and there's no one who knows so little that he or she can't teach another. And so that concept of that your input, your engagement is important, and reaching out to those individuals who are not participating, asking questions to get that person to start being engaged, I think is one of the ways that we've dealt with it over the years.
Do any other panelists have thoughts about this before we turn it over to Q&A? All right, I turn it over to you, Henry.
I'll ask our panelists to go on video now, if they're comfortable doing so. I'll do the same. Hopefully you all can see me now. This says Stevens Initiative, but it's Henry, and my colleagues have been laughing at me for a week because every time I log in, it just says Stevens Initiative. So got to fix that. But there was a question in the chat, and I want to make sure I have it in front of me too, because it's sort of a segue from what we're talking about here. And I think Andy just asked about when you have participants who you're hearing from your facilitators or staff are not participating as fully as you might have hoped. And I think one of the main reasons for that at times can be discomfort that's not being vocalized, things that are, feelings that are not being fully shared. And there have been a few pieces recently, which one of our audience members here mentioned one, and I've seen some others. It also goes back to something that our presenter from the last session, Jamila Joffrey from the STEAM Museum Project mentioned. They have an icebreaker activity that asked participants, or that thought about asking participants to show or talk about their home setting now that we're all stuck at home, or now that many people are logging in from a home. That the activity would have been for people to show their home setting, and they realized that for many people who have unstable housing, or for whom home is not a safe place, that this was a potentially injurious activity, or an activity that could have an opposite of the desired effect. I've seen some higher education educators talking about conversations that would happen in their classroom in a physical space on campus. If the participant is connecting from where they live with their family, that things they might have said or aspects of their identity or of the way they would communicate wouldn't be safe for them in that setting. So I wonder, just generally, I'd like to know from the panelists, from the presenters, how do you approach when people seem to be avoiding or trying to not engage fully in a subject that you might have prepared and thought would be comfortable, but turns out to be less comfortable or less safe feeling than was anticipated? And especially in these conditions, how can we keep in mind that there are some significant dynamics or power imbalances at play in setting the terms of the discussion and deciding what's a good topic whether it's related to matters of personal identity or whether it's related to matters of structural inequalities between people of different backgrounds or places?
Well, I would offer one suggestion. This is really complex because, as both Ed and you have said, there are a number of reasons why these issues develop. But the COIL model involves two professors working together. And I think when these issues develop, I think it's a critical time, and one of the reasons why that model is so important, that one professor speaks to the other and says, I see that some students in your group seem uncomfortable, and lets that professor speak to his students or her students. It may be very difficult for the professor from the other culture to in any way bring this topic up, or certainly to interrogate. Now, this would not necessarily be true in every setting, such as in more of a Celia model. I don't think you would follow this path. But in more of a COIL model, where you have two groups who are clearly coming from different places, you need to use the two teachers as navigators to solve some of these issues. Obviously, this will not solve everything. It's just one piece of an approach to navigating those blockages.
Henry, I think you're referring to Erica's question in the chat box there too, and it looks like there's a difference not only in terms of, sometimes I think of the diversity in the US, but it looks like Erica's speaking about sort of the diversity, country diversity. And a lot of my work is in Cuba, and there's very specific narratives about Cuba that Americans have. And so beginning, before I even take my students to engage with our Cuban counterparts, we do a lot of work to understand how we develop those narratives. So I have my students who are graduate students of education typically watch films or read novels, things that they typically wouldn't do, to understand how Cuba is being portrayed. And then we kind of interrogate that throughout the class before we start the actual engagement. So if there's time beforehand, sometimes academic calendars are off, that might be a good use of time to try to educate your particular student group about that particular country context and how America or whatever country you're in has impacted or influenced that particular environment.
I want to ask a couple follow-ups on this because I think it's something that there's almost nothing more important than than getting questions of perspective and getting questions of including voices and making sure that the very design of a program and its conduct and the space that it creates are accessible to all in a meaningful way, in a way that is as empowering as possible and as honest as possible about power and about advantages and disadvantages. Ed, I know in the iEarn universe, there is a lot of focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which is sort of a catalyzing, focusing the mind kind of exercise that a lot of countries around the world have participated in. What are some ways that lens can be used in a way that gets everybody involved, but also does not put some people in more developed countries and people in developing countries on an unequal footing when it comes to feeling like they are part of the discussion, either as the subject or the object or the narrator or the narrated?
Great question. Yeah, from the very beginning, one of the main foci of iEarn was the young people making a difference in the world. So it wasn't purely academics. And when the SDGs came along, it became a very, very effective handle in which to put a context of whatever issue it was, whether it's education or some other form of development or environment, into an understandable framework that everybody was approaching from the same perspective. And those were the UN Sustainable Goals. And so when two classes or multiple classes are working, for example, on an environmental issue, it's very important that all of the various aspects of that environmental issue, whether one is creating the environmental problem or one is the victim of, or how are we both creating and both victims of the same issue, be built into that context. And you know, I mentioned in one of the other sessions is one about carbon footprint, and to this tool that was then tagged to the SDGs, young people saw how they were both contributors and also victims of, but also in the end, they realized that there is a role for everyone to play in addressing that particular issue based on their own socioeconomic situation, their own cultural environment. And so that SDG package was very effective in providing that global context of an issue when oftentimes we think of it from a very national or a local context.
Ramzi, are you still there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. The program that you worked on quite a bit recently is connecting young Americans and young Syrian refugees, often in Turkey. And the life circumstances of these people are generally quite radically different. And young people who are Syrian refugees have been going through some incredibly difficult circumstances. And that is often very closely related to the subject of the exchange that's happening. People are working on fabrication, oftentimes related to things very close to the Syrian conflict. How have you all navigated facing those issues and recognizing those differences in a way that creates space for people to engage each other actively and is also honest about disparities and big differences in experience?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely in the context we've worked in, a big part of what we do, kind of figuring out how to maneuver all of this. You know, in the beginning, our very first exchange experience, which was with a partner school in Florida, I actually went there and had a conversation with the students, basically with each group alone in the beginning, to kind of set expectations and give a sort of what I like to call a reality check of what those other kids actually live through, what their experience is day to day, you know, to avoid this bias that, oh, they're refugees, so their life must be completely miserable. And the joke I always make with students is I tell them they listen to the same extremely terrible music you listen to, and that should tell you enough about how similar you are. And even the kids find that funny, which is alarming because they know the music they listen to is terrible, but that's another conversation. But I also want to mention in reference to the earlier discussion on privacy. So when they're at school or in the space and they're joining a virtual meeting, they're already in school, right? So they're not revealing any additional privacy. When they're in their homes, this changes a little bit. And what we've done is we've insisted that there be no insistence that they actually have their videos on. We found that to be very important. If they don't want it, they don't. But at the same time, we do have in much smaller groups of 2 to 3 advising sessions. And during those sessions, mentors will ask kids if they want to have their videos on. They're usually more comfortable. And that often acts as a way for them to realize, actually, this is okay.
We have some really good questions that have been typed in the chat box. I know we're not going to have time to cover all of them, but it's been hopefully a rich discussion, and we'll try to cover a few more questions now. If you have any more, you can type in the Q&A box. There's also been a lively discussion of some really interesting topics in the chat box too, so I want to thank all of you who've been posing questions there and also answering them on behalf of yourself and as part of a community. It's been a very robust space, which is more than we could have hoped for. We have a question about working with young people, specifically at this time during the pandemic when many young people are home. And so the question is, for those especially who worked in the primary or secondary school environment, can you give advice for getting parents involved and supporting their kids to participate in virtual exchange while they're at home? And if anyone from the higher ed space wants to answer it as well, that's welcome. So where does your mind go when you think about running virtual exchange in a home setting?
We get excited actually in IRN because you can access the IRN platform from anywhere, home or after school or in a classroom. And we always valued actually young people working at home because their parents could see actually what was going on. And there's so much mystique and sometimes fear about what the internet is all about, particularly for the K-12 community. We found it very constructive and very educational to have the parents realize what was happening and being engaged. And actually many of the projects in IRN involved interviewing their parents or bring their grandparents. And so it would really help to have, it helps to have them nearby, to have those family members involved in the actual discussion. So that's just one observation over the years.
We've had several questions about how to work with educators or others. Maybe it's staff members at a non-governmental organization or teachers or professors or other folks. How would you approach, or how have you approached those people or worked with them to encourage them to get involved or to find a way to make it work with their career and worth it for them to get involved and stay involved? How do you approach that kind of conversation, and what incentives have been helpful? I think this might be true for nearly all of our presenters, that this is a relevant question.
I can make a small attempt at answering. I mean, it's not an easy question, but I think my answer also applies to the question before of how to get parents bought in or feel comfortable, is that actually showing the impact has been huge. So parents will be skeptical, but then they look at what their kids are doing, or the impact on kind of their interpersonal relationships, or even just their experience with school or with learning. It automatically shifts the mentality where they find this virtual exchange to actually be something very meaningful to their kids. Similarly, a large portion of the team at NewView or at Karam who do this teaching come from backgrounds in architecture and engineering with advanced degrees, and they actually move towards this opportunity to have a high impact on teenagers, younger kids, young adults, and also on themselves to be in an experience of continued learning.
John, you've been on the road for many years, sharing your experience and waving the flag for collaborative online international learning and virtual exchange. You might not even think it's the right frame to use to talk about convincing people to do COIL or virtual exchange, but how do you approach the question or conversations about motivation and sustaining that motivation to be involved in this field?
Well, of course, it's changed quite a bit in the last 8 weeks, because we're in a crisis, and we're also in a place where so many people are teaching online now who never did before. So that's one of the hurdles that stood in people's way. I'm not sure that unto itself is something we should rely on, because of course many of us can't wait until we don't have to be online all the time. But it is helpful in the present. I think what you have to do at institutions is draw out those people, the innovators, the early adopters, whatever you want to call them, who will instantaneously find this attractive. And it's going to be a very small to medium subset of everybody. And you want to get those people involved, and you want to get them doing a great job, so you need to support them, and you want to have them be presenting back to other faculty and students to students what happened. And once everybody starts seeing that, then at least the value of it will be evident to the students and the teachers who maybe earlier thought, oh God, this is just more work. But it still leaves you to turn the corner. And I think that depends a lot on the institutional culture in which you're working. That is, what is consciously or unconsciously expected, for instance, of teachers in terms of engaging students. Like, you know, I mean, for instance, just to give a awkward example, at some research universities, don't want to overgeneralize, teaching is looked at as very secondary to the research work that the teachers do. Whereas, let's say at many community colleges, the teaching is what people do. They may do some research, but that's secondary. So it's easier in a way at a community college to promote this kind of activity than it might be at a high-end research university. So there are a lot of factors at play in this, but I think giving examples of successes, and then to some degree, if you can, providing some incentive to the professors. If we're looking at that end of it, it could be financial, it could simply be at the end of the year, the beginning of year at convocation, announcing these are our stellar COIL professors. That doesn't cost any money, but is really important to show that, let's say, the administration at least thinks this is really important. And finally, it's developing a culture on your campus that promotes curricular internationalization or internationalization at home, because COIL work, virtual exchange work, really should be part of something like that that's much broader. If it's just virtual exchange sitting out there like in a corner as some weird new practice, well, you'll get a few early adopters and that's all. It has to somehow be integrated into the university's approach to teaching and learning.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Ed too. And I'm sorry, Taylor, I want to throw the last question to you, but we're running really low on time, so I want to just give a closing round to today's presenters. And we haven't prepared for this, so it's a very good simulation for the thought experiment I want you and Ramzi to go through right now. We've gone through 3 sessions. I think many of today's participants have been here for all 3 of them. We've given links to lots of online resources. There's hundreds of hours of trainings and materials to look at out there, but people who are new to this space are probably under quite a bit of time pressure and outside constraints when it comes to trying to do this perfectly. And there is no way to do it perfectly the first time. So for Ramzi and Taylor, if you had to think of all of the kind of supposed key concepts, think of one key concept that if you were doing this the first time under constraints, you just throw it out the window and just not worry about it too much. And what's the one key concept that you would, even if it was in the back only, even if you thought it only was moderately important, in hindsight, thinking back to your early days, that it's actually really important. So what would you kind of try to forget, and what would you definitely make sure not to forget as you were getting started?
I'll jump in. I think the key concept I would keep, right, is the collaborative nature of this. You really, really need to focus on building that partnership, finding some shared ownership of this particular course for the longevity of this, as well as the success, especially if you run into issues along the way, how you can problem solve. And in terms of the piece that I would throw out is this notion that virtual exchange needs to be synchronous at all times, right? Thinking about the asynchronous space, the ability to complement the synchronous space, or having an exchange that has very little of that. So I'll turn it over to Ramzi for his thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Taylor, for, I guess, answering for the both of us, because that's almost exactly what I'd say. But to look at it in a slightly different light, I would say, rather than worry so much about what they're going to be learning and what the content is, I would shift my focus to actually what the encounter will be like, what the virtual experience will be, and the learning will come very smoothly after that.
Thank you so much. And as we tick into the last moments of the session, I just want to thank all of our presenters, Ed and John, who presented during our first session last week, Jamila and Khulud, who presented on Tuesday, and Taylor and Ramzi today. Thank you all for moving things around to be available on such short notice, for really diving into your topics and sharing your years and decades of experience very generously with the community. I want to turn off our videos now and go back to the slides for just a minute so that I can walk through some next steps. Hopefully you all can see my screen. We are going to send out a communication coming up where we'll solicit some feedback about how these sessions went and anything else that you can tell us about what we could do to support your work in the months ahead. We'll be offering more mentoring sessions soon. We know that the mentoring sessions we've already made available have been almost entirely subscribed by you, so we know that we need to make more sessions available soon. We'll try to do that and let you know. We've opened a grant competition for US, Middle East, and North Africa region virtual exchange programs, and we've published a resources page, and all of that is available via the link below, stevensinitiative.org/pandemicresponse2020. Thank you again so much for joining us. Thanks again to our presenters and to my colleague Andy for being a co-host here with me today, to the Stevens Initiative team, to my colleagues Phoebe and Haley and Andy for being indispensable in organizing all of these events. We're so grateful you joined us, and we hope to hear from you about anything else we can do to support your journey to virtual exchange. Thanks so much, and have a great day.